If you had difficulty with the Ellis reading, don't worry about it. Hopefully, I can clarify a few things here about the reading and the history behind the founding of the country. And if you're still unclear about this, hopefully, we'll have an opportunity to discuss it a bit further and you'll get it after all that. So, when we talk about the Republican experiment, we're talking about the republic that was the United States, right? This idea that this was an experiment. It was nothing was sure and certain about whether or not it would work. And the founders knew this. And so we're going to be talking about the founding of the country and the ideas and the issues and the principles behind it. So we're going to be focusing on the 6 things that Ellis focuses on, right? The importance of natural resources, the significance of being not at the center of things, but very much kind of on the edge of things. We were considered to be kind of a backwater, far away, isolated, uneducated part of the British Empire. But despite that, we had a lot of our founders believed in these Enlightenment ideas that came over from Europe. I'm not sure if you got to that last year in World Cultures, but the Enlightenment was a period where Europeans were asking a lot of questions about ideal governments and the way things should be. So there was also at this period of time a beginning of a rejection of an aristocracy, this idea that people should be born to positions of power and influence, and the idea that people should earn their own position in the world, which is obviously something that we still believe in today, even if it's not entirely true. We'll be talking about the founding fathers not as individuals so much as then as a group, a big group of very intelligent, very forward-thinking people that were working together to create this new country. And then we'll talk about a country that was dividing church and state in ways which were really revolutionary for its time. So we've talked a little bit about this already, this idea of being in this isolated position on the edge of the empire, in that little orange area on the coastline. Those are the original colonies. And again, beginning to move towards the west. And we can do that because Spain and France, the other powers, the colonial powers in the American continent at that time, are beginning to slip. At that time, they don't have the same power. So the American people, as they expanded in population, could begin to move to the West. So how was the West viewed? It was viewed almost like a weird kind of alternate reality, almost like going to the moon or something. Jefferson had heard rumors of giants that roamed around in the West, huge prehistoric animals, almost like dinosaurs that were wandering around out there. And so there was this tremendous fascination with what the West held. So that obviously leads people to want to go out there. So this idea of this country as this sort of blank slate where anything could be written on it, which was a very arrogant way of looking at it if you think about it, because of course this was Native American land. And of course we don't look at that, we just look at the resources that could be taken from this land. We obviously don't focus on the slave owning aspect either. We focus only on the future of freedom, which becomes this sort of mantra of this new government. So obviously what was missing was a lot of the realities of the frontier. At the same time, there was this very idealistic thinking about government and the importance of human rights, which is ironic given that most of the people in this picture, these are British people talking about it in an ideal setting. This is a bunch of aristocrats talking about freedom, right? What a joke for poor people. What a joke, a bunch of white people are talking about freedom. Many of them are slave owners. This is a hypocrisy which is at the center part of our country. But at the same time, they were worried about too much power in the government. So separation of powers, this idea of different branches of government, the idea that democracy was a good thing, and this idea of ideal forms of government. And in this ideal form, you needed an ideal leader. While King George III was sort of a corrupt, kind of crazy king who inherited his position, George Washington was very much somebody who earned it, even though he himself inherited slaves and inherited social position. He became famous for his successes in the French-Indian War, and then obviously for his tremendous leadership during the Revolutionary War. So Washington is going to become this kind of ideal leader because he doesn't really want his leadership role. In fact, after the revolution is over, many of his men suggested he should take over the government. Instead of doing that, he surrenders his sword and he gives up his power, which many European kings just simply didn't believe that he could do. He does it again when he surrenders the presidency after 2 terms, which leads us to the 2-term standard in the presidency. He gives up his power again, and that makes him seen by many Americans as a kind of a virtuous and good man. So Washington had this belief that his real virtue came from being, a man on his plantation working alone and returning from war back to this sort of farming ideal. And again, the myth of Cincinnatus is this myth that he had of this Roman figure who did the same thing, who left his military role to go back to his land. And there he is with his slaves, or the enslaved people there who are obviously don't look at George Washington the same way as the white people do. Not maybe, definitely. When you think about the Founding Fathers, those of you who are Hamilton fans, obviously there he is on the right, but these guys are all like the big important folks in the founding of the government. Washington being the first president, Jefferson being the philosopher of the Declaration, Madison being the architect of the Constitution, Hamilton being a very important person behind the leadership of Washington, Ben Franklin, who was the elder statesman and a guy who spent a lot of time in Europe, allowing us to kind of be an independent country by negotiating with European powers. John Adams, who was kind of a hothead and a person who led the revolutionary effort and then became president. James Monroe, who was a lawyer who negotiated a lot of the land deals that occur later. And then Gouverneur Morris, who was one of the people that wrote the Constitution. So when we talk about the Founding Fathers, these guys all worked together. They didn't necessarily like each other. But I think overall they respected each other's intelligence and believed they could found something of importance, which they did. So on that theme, these 2 men, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were from different political parties, believed different things about government. They actually were very ideologically opposed, but still very much friends with each other. They were corresponding with each other right on their deathbeds. Still talking about how to make the best country they could. So last piece of this, the significance of separation of church and state, very important because actually it makes us, interestingly, a more religious country, right? When religion isn't mandated, people want to do it on their own time and their own practices, right? And they know the government won't get involved in this. So we'll talk about Washington. We'll do more with this in another class, but obviously Washington will be held up as this ideal by white America. A lot of African Americans never forgot that he was a slave owner, right? And wanted to emphasize that, and obviously we understate that. White people tend to understate that in his legacy, but it's got to be mentioned because it's part of who he was and part of the weakness of our country from the very beginning. So our major failures as a country, slavery is the biggest of all of them, right? These guys, most of them were slave owners. They understated the importance of that. They disrespected and disregarded the very people that made them the wealth that they gave them, the position that they had. And obviously the mistreatment of Native peoples is another major weakness of this, and not something that we focus on so much at the founding. We tend to celebrate the glories of the American government without looking at how bad things were. So last piece, I want you to think about all these things and which is most significant, and you can do this on your own time. Hopefully this gave you a little bit better overview of things, and if it's not clear, we'll go over it in class.